Good evening. We begin with breaking news. The U.S. Senate has acquitted former President Donald Trump on the impeachment charge of inciting last month's deadly siege at the Capitol and siding with the mob that attacked the heart of American democracy in his name. The verdict, 57-43, short of the two-thirds majority needed to convict. 7 Republicans sided with all Democrats and 2 independents to vote guilty.
Hey everyone, welcome. William is here. Here's what just happened, guys. In this imagined scene, the Senate gavel comes down 68-32. 10 Republicans, including Collins, Murkowski, and Hawley, crossing the aisle. The two-thirds threshold everyone called impossible cleared, and Trump declared unfit to serve effective immediately. In that single moment, the entire architecture of American political power rearranges itself. After everything that came before, after all the court battles and the tariff wars and the contempt warrants and the survivor testimony and the cabinet resignations, it all comes down to this one parliamentary action. One vote, one gavel strike, one constitutional mechanism that has never been used successfully in the history of the Republic, finally being activated in the most dramatic fashion imaginable.
Correspondent Chris Van Cleve followed it all, including some surprises, and joins us from Capitol Hill. Chris?
Adriana, the former president is claiming victory tonight, saying in a statement his impeachment was just another phase of the greatest witch hunt in our country's history. But this vote, while unsuccessful, was the most bipartisan vote to convict an impeached president in U.S. history.
And somewhere in the White House residence, Donald Trump is watching the coverage on a television screen completely alone, except for a handful of remaining aides, and he is staring in stunned silence as the reality of what has just happened crashes over him.
The insurrection at the Capitol and President Trump's role in inciting it has led to consideration of something unprecedented in modern history, invoking the 25th Amendment to declare the president unfit and thus remove him from office.
His presidency is gone, just gone, taken from him not by voters, not by term limits, and not by the slow grinding machinery of the justice system, but by the swift constitutional blade of the 25th Amendment, wielded by his own party.
J.B. Pritzker tonight is calling for President Trump to be removed, asking for the 25th Amendment to be invoked. It is in response to President Trump telling military leaders earlier today that, quote, dangerous cities like Chicago should be used as a training ground for the military. Our political reporter Marianne Ahern with the story.
This is the scenario that every political analyst and every talking head and every constitutional scholar insisted could never actually happen. They all said the same thing with absolute confidence. You cannot remove a sitting president through the 25th Amendment. The bar is simply too high. You need 2/3 of the Senate, 67 votes.
What would be involved if the 25th Amendment were to be successfully invoked?
For this to actually happen, there would have to be a majority of those senior advisors, those cabinet officials who go to the vice president and say, we collectively believe that the president should not remain in office. The vice president would have to agree to that. The president can object, and if he objects, then Congress has to weigh in, and a 2/3 majority in the House and the Senate would have to be on board with doing so.
A supermajority that requires significant bipartisan consensus. How are you possibly going to convince members of the president's own party to vote against him? How are you going to flip enough Republicans to reach that threshold when the base would eviscerate anyone who dared to break ranks? It is impossible. That was the conventional wisdom.
Incoming Majority Leader Senator Chuck Schumer is calling for the immediate removal of President Trump from office. The president is accused of inciting violence and egging on his supporters who stormed the U.S. Capitol building yesterday. Now, Senator Schumer wants President Trump out of the White House, either by invoking the 25th Amendment or by Congress reconvening to impeach him again.
That was what everyone believed right up until the moment when it stopped being true. But the question that nobody was asking loudly enough was the one that actually mattered. What happens when the impossible becomes not just possible, but politically necessary? What happens when the pressure builds to such an unbearable intensity that leaving Trump in office becomes more dangerous for Republican senators than removing him? What happens when suburban Republican lawmakers look at their own polling numbers and their own re-election prospects and their own consciences and realize that standing by this president means the destruction of their careers and their party?
Republican Congressman Adam Kinzinger of Illinois is joining the growing calls for the removal of President Trump. He posted this clip on Twitter just a short time ago.
Sadly, yesterday, it became evident that not only has the president abdicated his duty to protect the American people and the people's house, he invoked and inflamed passions that only gave fuel to the insurrection that we saw here.
What happens when they flip? What happens when they actually cast the vote that ends a presidency? That is the moment we are discussing here. That is the scenario that reshapes the entire political universe. And it all comes down to one word: pressure. The kind of pressure that builds slowly at first and then all at once, converging from multiple directions simultaneously until the dam breaks and the unthinkable becomes inevitable. Consider what has to accumulate to get us to that point on the Senate floor.
Well, Mugo, a senior White House official tells me that he expressed to the conference that he is growing frustrated with all the holdouts, and he wants every single Republican to vote yes. Actually, you can take a listen to what he had to say when he was asked about this at the Capitol.
What's your message to the holdouts?
Well, it's not a question of holdouts. We have a tremendously unified party. I don't think we've ever had a party like this. There are some people that want a couple of things that maybe I don't like or that they're not going to get. But I think we're going to have tremendous, not luck, we have tremendous talent. This man has done an incredible job as Speaker.
The Epstein survivors have organized a relentless media campaign that has saturated every news cycle for weeks. Their faces are on every screen. Their voices are on every channel. Their stories are being told in every publication. They are holding press conferences on Capitol Hill, standing beside oversized portraits of the victims who never got to tell their own stories. They are sitting down for primetime interviews with the most respected journalists in the country. They are making their case directly to the American people with a moral clarity that makes it impossible to look away. And the cumulative effect of all this testimony is devastating because it transforms an abstract scandal into something viscerally human and undeniably real. Then you have the courtroom witness, the one whose testimony everyone has been waiting for, the one who was inside the operation and knows where the bodies are buried. Under the pressure of cross-examination and the weight of potential perjury charges, this witness finally breaks. The name comes out. The connection is made explicit. Trump is linked directly to the cover-up, not through innuendo or speculation, but through sworn testimony delivered under penalty of law. The transcript of that moment circulates immediately, screenshots spreading across social media faster than any spin operation can contain them. The legal wall that Trump's team has spent years constructing begins to crumble because a witness with first-hand knowledge has just blown a hole through it that cannot be patched. At the same time, the Attorney General makes a decision that sends shockwaves through the entire administration. Pam Bondi, who was supposed to be Trump's ultimate legal protector, the person installed specifically to shield him from accountability, looks at the evidence that has been assembled. She reads the witness transcripts. She examines the documents. She consults with her own legal advisors about her own potential exposure. And she reaches the conclusion that staying loyal to this president means risking her own law license, her own reputation, and potentially her own freedom. So she walks. She submits her resignation effective immediately, and her departure becomes the signal that everyone in the cabinet has been waiting for. If the person whose entire job was to protect Trump legally has decided that he is indefensible, then what does that say about the situation for everyone else? The contempt warrant from Judge Sullivan lands next, and it lands with the force of a legal sledgehammer. Trump has been defying court orders, refusing to comply with document requests, treating the judicial branch with the same contempt he has shown every other institution that has tried to hold him accountable. But Sullivan is not backing down, and the warrant makes clear that there are real consequences for continued defiance. The possibility of immediate detention becomes suddenly very real. Federal marshals could actually show up to enforce the warrant. Trump could actually be taken into custody. And the psychological impact of that threat transforms his behavior in ways that accelerate the crisis. He starts lashing out on his social media platform at all hours of the day and night, posting increasingly unhinged rants about fake victims and deep state conspiracies and the betrayal of everyone around him. Every post he makes becomes another piece of evidence that he is mentally unraveling under the pressure, and every outburst makes it harder for his defenders to argue that he is fit to lead. This is the convergence that changes the political calculus for Republican senators. It is not about loyalty anymore. It stopped being about loyalty the moment the survivor testimony started dominating every news cycle. It is about survival now, pure and simple. The calls are flooding into Senate offices from constituents who have had enough. Suburban women who have been the backbone of Republican electoral success in competitive districts are calling and writing and making clear that they will not support anyone who defends this president. Independent voters who might have been willing to give the party the benefit of the doubt on economic policy are saying that the moral line has been crossed and there is no going back. The polling data that senators are seeing in their own internal surveys is catastrophic. The party is heading toward an electoral cliff, and standing next to Trump means going over the edge with him. The conversation that happens behind closed doors is the one that actually determines the outcome. The Speaker of the House is on the phone with key senators, and he is being blunt in a way that politicians rarely allow themselves to be. What is your actual plan here? What is the move? Because if we do nothing, if we allow this to continue, there is no recovery. We become the party that defended the indefensible. We become the party that stood by a president who was linked under oath to child trafficking and sexual abuse. We lose every suburban woman in America. We lose the House in the midterms. We lose the Senate. We get relegated to minority status for a generation, and the party that we have spent our entire careers building gets reduced to a regional faction that cannot compete nationally. That is the calculation that forces the flip. Removing Trump stops being an act of betrayal and becomes an act of salvation. It becomes the move that lets Republican senators go back to their constituents and say that they took action when action was required, that they put country over party, that they upheld the Constitution, that they were the adults in the room when the room was on fire. That narrative resonates with suburban voters. That narrative gives them a path to re-election. That narrative saves the party from complete destruction. The cabinet has already done its part. 9 secretaries have signed the declaration under Section 4 of the 25th Amendment, formally stating that the president is unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office. The vice president has concurred. The mechanism is already in motion. The House has already passed the articles of removal, with enough Republicans joining the Democrats to send a clear message that this is not a partisan exercise, but a constitutional one. And now it all comes down to the Senate. It all comes down to whether 67 senators are willing to cast the vote that has never been cast before in American history. At 5:45 in the evening, after hours of debate and procedural maneuvering and cloakroom negotiations, they do it. The roll is called, the votes are tallied, the gavel falls, 68-32, Trump is out. And within minutes, Vance is being sworn in as the presidency changes hands without any of the ceremony or transition planning that normally accompanies such an event. It just happens, swift and definitive, and there is nothing that Trump can do to reverse it. The legal landscape transforms the instant that oath is administered. Trump is no longer president, which means he no longer has access to the protections that the office provides. He cannot pardon himself. He cannot order the Justice Department to drop investigations. He cannot claim executive privilege to shield documents from prosecutors. He is a private citizen now, and a private citizen with multiple active criminal investigations swirling around him is in a very different position than a sitting president. Sullivan's contempt warrant can now be enforced without any constitutional complications. Federal marshals can actually carry out the arrest. The court orders that Trump has been defying for months suddenly have teeth because the person they are directed at no longer has the power of the presidency to hide behind. The entire legal equation shifts in favor of accountability. Vance, for his part, can now act as an actual president rather than as a placeholder waiting for instructions. He can appoint a new attorney general who is not compromised by involvement in the previous administration's scandals. He can restore the independence of the Justice Department. He can begin the process of rebuilding relationships with international allies who have been alienated by years of chaotic and transactional foreign policy. He can actually govern, which means making decisions, negotiating with Congress, conducting diplomacy, and doing all of the normal things that presidents do without the constant backdrop of scandal and crisis that defined his predecessor's time in office. For the Republican Party, This is the lifeline they desperately needed. It is not a clean escape, and it comes with enormous short-term costs. The base will be furious. The most devoted Trump supporters will see this as the ultimate betrayal, and they will not forget it quickly. But the alternative was worse. The alternative was defending Trump through every stage of the legal process while watching suburban voters and independents flee the party in numbers that would guarantee electoral catastrophe. The removal gives Republicans a chance to reset, to rebuild, to make the argument that they are the party of constitutional order rather than personality cult. It is painful medicine, but it is the only medicine available. The global reaction is immediate and dramatic. Financial markets, which had been pricing in increasing political instability, respond to the news with a surge of relief. Trading halts briefly as the systems absorb the shock, but when they reopen, the trajectory is sharply upward. The dollar strengthens. Investors who had been pulling capital out of American markets due to uncertainty begin to reverse those positions. The world's major allies issue statements that are carefully diplomatic but unmistakably relieved. The era of waking up to inflammatory social media posts threatening tariffs or military action against friendly nations appears to be over, and the international community exhales collectively. The initial embarrassment of having a president removed midterm is real, but it is quickly replaced by something more durable. A recognition that American institutions actually functioned as designed, that checks and balances have meaning, that the constitutional order is resilient enough to handle even the most extreme stress tests. That recognition actually enhances American soft power in the long run because it demonstrates that the country has the capacity to self-correct. Trump watches all of this unfold from the White House residence, and the silence from his corner is deafening. For 9 hours after the Senate vote, there is nothing. No posts on his social media platform, no statements released through surrogates, no phone calls to friendly media figures, just silence. The man who has dominated the national conversation for years with an endless stream of commentary and attack and self-promotion has been rendered speechless by the reality that his own party, his own senators, the people he helped elect and elevate, have voted to end his presidency. When he finally breaks his silence in the early hours of the morning, the post is exactly what you would expect: rage and denial and accusations of betrayal, claims that the vote was illegal and unconstitutional, promises to fight in court and to never surrender. But the moment has passed. The constitutional process has been completed. The Senate has spoken with a bipartisan supermajority, and there is no appeal to a higher authority. The presidency belongs to Vance now, and Trump's only remaining identity is that of a private citizen facing a legal system that is no longer constrained by the complications of prosecuting a sitting president. The mechanics of how we arrived at this historic moment are actually straightforward once you understand the constitutional architecture. Section 4 of the 25th Amendment was designed precisely for situations where the president could not or would not recognize his own incapacity. It provides that when the vice president and a majority of the cabinet transmit a written declaration that the president is unable to discharge the duties of the office, the vice president immediately becomes acting president. The process then moves to Congress, where the House votes on articles of removal by simple majority, and the Senate must achieve a 2/3 supermajority to make the removal permanent. If the Senate fails to reach that threshold, the president can be restored. But if 67 senators vote to sustain the removal, the decision is final and irreversible. The framers of the amendment understood that this would be an extraordinary measure reserved for extraordinary circumstances, and they set the bar appropriately high. But they also understood that circumstances might arise where the political survival instinct of members of Congress would align with the constitutional interest in removing an unfit president, and they trusted that the system would work when it needed to. The cabinet declaration is the trigger, and in this scenario, it comes together because the evidence has become overwhelming and the personal stakes for the cabinet members themselves have become too high to ignore. These are not political appointees who owe their careers to Trump in the traditional sense. Many of them have their own reputations and their own futures to consider. When the Attorney General resigns rather than continue defending the president, it sends an unmistakable signal about the legal jeopardy that anyone associated with the administration now faces. 9 cabinet secretaries conclude that the president is no longer capable of executing his duties, not because of any medical diagnosis, but because his behavior has become so erratic and his legal exposure so consuming that he cannot focus on governing. The declaration is signed. The vice president, who has seen everything from the inside and understands exactly how dysfunctional the situation has become, adds his concurrence. The process is now in motion, and there is no stopping it without a congressional vote. The House vote follows quickly because the leadership understands that delaying would only make the political damage worse. The articles of removal pass with Democratic support and a significant number of Republican votes, enough to demonstrate that this is a bipartisan action grounded in genuine concern rather than partisan opportunism. The debate on the House floor is somber rather than triumphant. Members from both parties speak about the gravity of the moment and the historical weight of what they are being asked to do. The vote is recorded and the articles are transmitted to the Senate for the final determination. The Senate debate is where the real political drama unfolds, because this is where the supermajority requirement creates genuine suspense. Every senator knows that their vote will be scrutinized for years to come. Every senator understands that they are making a decision that will define their legacy. The moderate Republicans from swing states are the key bloc, the ones whose votes will determine whether the threshold is met. Collins has been signaling her discomfort with the president's behavior for months, and her vote to remove is not entirely surprising to close observers. Murkowski has a long history of independence from party orthodoxy, and her vote follows a similar logic. The real turning point comes when Hawley announces his position. He has been one of the more combative voices in the Republican conference, a figure closely associated with the populist wing of the party. When he decides that the evidence has crossed a line that even he cannot ignore, it opens the floodgates. 7 more Republicans follow. Enough to push the total to 68, one more than the constitutional minimum. The gavel comes down and history is made. The transition of power happens with a speed that is almost disorienting. There is no inauguration ceremony, no parade, no balls. The Chief Justice administers the oath to Vance in a small ceremony at the Capitol, and the machinery of government immediately begins shifting to the new administration. The White House staff who served Trump are given a brief period to collect their belongings and depart. The national security apparatus, which has been operating in a state of constant crisis management, begins the process of stabilizing under new leadership. The military leadership, which has been watching the political chaos with growing alarm, issues statements affirming their commitment to the constitutional order and the new commander-in-chief. The peaceful transfer of power, the hallmark of American democracy, occurs as it was designed to occur, smoothly and without violence. The consequences for Trump personally are immediate and severe. His legal exposure, which was always significant, becomes acute now that he can no longer claim the protections of the presidency. The contempt warrant that Sullivan issued can now be executed. The various criminal investigations that have been proceeding slowly through the courts can now move forward without the complicating factor of the defendant being the sitting president. His legal team, which has been shrinking as the political prospects have dimmed, faces the challenge of mounting a defense in multiple jurisdictions simultaneously without the resources or the leverage that the presidency provided. The man who once seemed untouchable is now touchable in every sense, and the legal system begins to do its work without the political interference that had previously shielded him. For the Republican Party, the aftermath is complicated but survivable. The immediate backlash from the base is intense and painful. Fundraising takes a hit. Primary challenges are threatened against every Republican who voted for removal. Activist groups that have been built around Trump's personality rather than any particular policy agenda are thrown into disarray, but the party leadership understands that the alternative was worse, that defending Trump through years of criminal proceedings would have been an anchor around the neck of every Republican candidate in every competitive race in the country. The removal gives them distance, a chance to argue that they acted responsibly when the evidence demanded it. A narrative that resonates with the suburban voters and independents who will determine control of Congress in the next election. It is not a comfortable position, but it is a survivable one. and survival is the first priority of any political institution. The international implications ripple outward in ways that reinforce the resilience of the American system. Allies who had been questioning whether the United States could still be considered a reliable partner are reassured by the demonstration that constitutional checks still function. Adversaries who had been exploiting the political chaos to advance their own interests are forced to recalibrate. The global order, which had been under stress from years of transactional and unpredictable American foreign policy, begins to stabilize. This is not to say that all problems are solved or that the new administration will not face its own challenges, but the removal of the immediate source of instability allows the international community to resume something closer to normal diplomatic relations with Washington. The deeper lesson of this entire experience is about the nature of political power in a constitutional republic. The presidency is an office of immense authority, but it is not an office of unlimited authority. The Constitution provides mechanisms for addressing situations where the occupant of that office is no longer capable of fulfilling his duties, and those mechanisms can be activated when the political branches muster the will to use them. The threshold is high by design, as it should be for something as consequential as removing a duly elected president. But the threshold is not insurmountable. And when the evidence of unfitness becomes overwhelming and the pressure from constituents becomes undeniable, the political calculation shifts in ways that make the previously unthinkable suddenly achievable. The system worked because it was designed to work, and the design held even under the most extreme stress test it has ever faced. The scene at 5:45 in the evening, with the gavel coming down and the clerk reading the final tally and the Chief Justice presiding over the end of one presidency and the beginning of another, will be remembered as one of the defining moments of American constitutional history. It is the moment when the Republic demonstrated that no individual, no matter how powerful or how defiant, is above the constitutional order. It is the moment when the separation of powers proved its enduring value. It is the moment when the Senate, exercising its constitutional responsibility, declared that the president was unfit and removed him from office. And it all happened in a single afternoon, in a single vote, with a single gavel strike that echoed through the chamber and through the history books. The presidency of Donald Trump ended not with an election defeat or a term limit expiration, but with the activation of a constitutional safeguard that had been waiting for exactly this moment since it was ratified decades ago. The 25th Amendment, that provision which political scientists debated and journalists explained and presidents feared, had finally been used and the republic endured.